There's a lot to play for in Week 17 in both conferences. There are 5 teams that are still mathematically alive and competing for a playoff spot. Tennessee, Pittsburgh, Oakland, Dallas, and Philadelphia all can still make the playoffs, and all of them can still be eliminated. And besides that, what do all 5 of these teams have in common? They're all playing at 4:25. Nothing at 1 o'clock matters. The NFL has a Week 17 problem, and it needs to be fixed. To understand the root of the problem, we need to talk about how we got to this point to begin with. I made a previous video about this, but in 2010, Commissioner Roger Goodell was frustrated with games in Week 17 not mattering. And this was highlighted when the Jets made it into the playoffs after beating up on Curtis Painter and JT O'Sullivan. So beginning in 2010, all Week 17 games would be divisional games. No longer could you play an out-of-conference opponent in Week 17. The move made a lot of sense, and I don't think any NFL fan is complaining about this change. And sure enough, since this change was implemented, it seems like we've gotten a bunch of big games in the final week of the season. It seems like every year, there's at least one division title or one winner-go-home game that's being decided on the final day of the season. For some perspective on how bad it used to be, in 2006, the Sunday Night Football game on the final week of the season involved the Green Bay Packers, who were 7-8 entering the game and had no shot at making the playoffs, and the Chicago Bears, who had locked up the number 1 seed in the NFC at this point. The game literally meant nothing. And this was with flex scheduling. This was the best the NFL could do for their marquee game. Nobody has a problem with the change itself. Divisional games in Week 17 are a good thing. You're more likely to have a game that means something that way. The problem comes in the execution of Week 17, because the way the NFL is going about this is all wrong. This year, there are 5 teams that heading into Week 17 can either enter the playoffs or can be eliminated entirely. And all 5 of these teams are playing at the exact same time, which makes the 1 o'clock slate of games essentially meaningless. Sure, there's a seeding question here and there to be decided, but no playoff spot can be decided at 1 o'clock. You could essentially skip the entire slate of 1 o'clock games on Sunday and miss absolutely nothing. And this is where the problem lies. Because of the NFL's quest to make Week 17 as meaningful as possible, on a yearly basis, they've found a way to make half of it meaningless. Last year was the same thing. There were 6 teams last year that were fighting for a spot at the playoffs. None of them played in the early slate of games. And the same thing happened in 2017. 6 teams were fighting for a playoff spot, and none of them played in the early slate of games. The last time a team that could have either made the playoffs or gone home played in the early slate was back in 2016, when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers did it. But I have to put a big fat asterisk next to that, because for Tampa Bay to make the playoffs, they would have had to win their game, Washington would have had to tie the New York Giants, Green Bay would have had to lose, and Tennessee, Indy, Dallas, and San Francisco all would have had to win. 7 things had to happen, including a tie. They were all but eliminated. Since the NFL implemented this divisional change in 2010, I looked at every single game, and I took a look at the number of teams that faced a possible win or go home situation. These were the teams that hadn't clinched a spot, and by the end of the day, either could have made the playoffs or missed it. The last time that both the 1 o'clock slate and the 4 o'clock slate mattered for the playoffs was all the way back in 2014. At 1 o'clock, the AFC wildcard picture between San Diego, Baltimore, Kansas City, and Houston was decided. And at 4 o'clock, a winner-take-all, loser-go-home bout for the NFC South between Atlanta and Carolina took place. In the last 7 seasons, 2014 was literally the only time that the 1 o'clock slate of games had any implication on who made the playoffs. Now note that in 2012, the Bears played at 1 o'clock, and they could have made the playoffs or gone home, but their game didn't matter, as due to tiebreakers, the only way that they actually would have clinched a playoff berth was with a Minnesota loss or tie. regardless of whether or not the Bears actually won their game or not. So much like the Bucs in 2016, this doesn't count. In the last 7 years, one of the slates of games has been meaningless 6 times. Was this really the idea that Commissioner Goodell had in mind when he made that schedule change? Probably not. Stacking the better action at 4 o'clock makes tons of sense, since the best ratings come there. But stacking literally all of the action there makes 1 o'clock a boring drag. So what's the solution here? Well, the NFL has been looking into expansion into Europe for quite some time now, where soccer reigns supreme. Maybe the league can take a page out of soccer's playbook. In soccer, the final day of the season is known as Decision Day. On the last day, all of the games take place at the exact same time. This leads to some incredible moments, such as in 2012, when the Premier League was won by Manchester City after they scored 2 stoppage time goals against QPR, stunning rivals Manchester United, who thought for sure that they had won the league. Now, am I suggesting that the NFL play all 16 of their games at the same time? Absolutely not. Obviously, the league would never go for that. But, much like MLS plays Eastern and Western Conference games at different times but plays all the games in the conference at the same time, I see no reason why the league can't play all of their conference games at the exact same time. Play all of the AFC games at 1 o'clock, and play all the NFC games at 4:25, or vice versa. You can even keep the Sunday Night Football game on NBC when necessary for a meaningful game with no implications on any other matchup. As an example of this, regardless of what happens in the other games, the battle between the Seahawks and the 49ers will decide the NFC West. Besides one of those games if it applies, all the AFC games take place at the exact same time, and all the NFC games take place at the exact same time. By doing this, the early and the late slate of games are both meaningful. From 2017 to 2019, there were 17 teams fighting for a spot in the playoffs in the final week of the season. None of those 17 teams played at 1 o'clock. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that in odd years under this scenario, the AFC played at 4:25, and in even years, the NFC played at 4:25, so they alternated. Under this scenario, assuming you leave Titans-Colts on Sunday Night Football last year in 2018, since it was one of those meaningful games that didn't rely on any other matchup, much like Seahawks-49ers this year, of those 15 remaining teams, you would have had 8 of them playing at 1 o'clock and 7 of them playing at 4 o'clock. Compared to what we ended up getting, which was 0 teams playing at 1 o'clock and 15 teams playing at 4 o'clock, it's much more balanced and makes the entire day meaningful instead of just one time slot. Over the last 7 years, we've had a bunch of games with playoff implications in Week 17. And yet, over the last 7 years, in 6 of them, one of the slates of games was completely meaningless on the composition of the playoff picture. This has to change. And a soccer-like format, where everyone in each conference plays at the same time, might be the way to fix it.